Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first meeting of 2022, the Citizen Oversight Board. Lots of activities this week with the board and public safety, so I think it'll be an interesting meeting and discussion. I understand Director Saldate is going to join us in just a few minutes. Okay, great. So we'll kick off with just a quick intro and comment from the new interim director. I believe he still needs to be appointed by council before we can call him the actual director. Okay, great. So that's our first order of business. We'll give that a few minutes and then get it as just some board management. We don't have any other special guests or topics for this week. So it may be a pretty quick public session if Greg doesn't have anything for the public side of the meeting. Okay, great. Hope everyone had nice holidays and managed to not get too sick. Seems like everyone I know got coronavirus the past month, so maybe that was true for others as well. Hi, Terrence.
Good morning.
Morning. How's
Hi,
everyone?
Terrence. How are you?
Pretty good.
Well,
Good.
thank you.
Your camera is really out of focus, Terrence. I feel like we're inside your eyeballs prior to your cataract surgery.
Really?
Oh, wow. I wonder what happened. Hold on, let me fix that.
Okay. And then somebody's logged on as a board guest. So is that Armando by chance? No.
I think that's probably Alyssa.
Okay.
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. It is Alyssa.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. I see you there now. Okay. Well, I mean, while we're waiting for Armando to join, we could possibly do a little bit of board business. If anyone has feedback or changes to the board minutes, we could talk through that now or perhaps move to approve them.
So moved.
Great.
So moved.
Great. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
All right, the motion passes.
Sorry.
Okay.
Never mind. I support the
got
minutes.
you. And you're in focus now. Okay, good. Okay. And I'll just keep moving until Armando joins. I'll give a quick update to the public on where we are with the hiring process. So over the last 2 weeks of December, the selection committee reviewed detailed resumes and packets of a number of candidates for the position. We are moving forward with interviews this next week of a down select selection of candidates. I'm pretty excited about what we saw in applicants, some traditional, some non-traditional applicants for the role. So those conversations, those interviews will happen next week. And then the committee will propose 3 candidates at least to the board for interviews in the subsequent weeks. We're also moving forward with discussions around the public engagement side of this hiring process. So have had a number of community conversations with community organizations and nonprofits working in the criminal justice space and reform space. So excited about the level of participation there and getting some best practices from other organizations. A community member who served on the RTD board, for example, during 2 hiring processes, provided some feedback and suggested approaches on how to engage the public based on his lessons learned. So I think there's lots of great opportunity for us to leverage, other folks' work on this. We have a meeting next week on this topic with a few community organizations who are particularly interested in this. And I know April and I are having some additional conversations about how that might go. So any board members particularly interested in the community engagement side, hit me up and we can loop you into that work. As a reminder, the community side of this will be somewhere in the mid to late February timeframe. Questions about that? All right. Couple of other things that I was going to follow up with the board on. As folks know, we met with Denver Health a few weeks ago to talk about their interaction and services that they provide to the Sheriff's Department. We asked for a number of follow-up questions and just clarification based on our meeting with them, and they've provided that back to the board. You know, we can talk about how the board wants to continue to engage or not engage on that set of that area of inquiry. You know, happy to take feedback or guidance from the board on how we want to proceed. It looks like Armando is joining us. Hopefully not driving. I think he's on the other side of the car. So. Armando, are you there? There you are.
I am here. I apologize. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, just fine.
Okay, I apologize to you all. I'm sorry for the delay. My phone was having trouble connecting. I'm calling you from the road. I'm not driving. My wife's driving.
Good job.
I want to apologize that I'm only able to spend a few minutes. I'm running late this morning. That was not my intention. I let at least know I'd be here at least for 10 minutes. And you get those full 10 minutes. Thank you for the invitation. We're actually driving to my swearing in right now. So we're just getting my daughter out of school and then heading over. I think that's going to be at 11:30 with Judge Rodarte. Extremely honored for and privileged for this opportunity. And one of the really good things that I'm looking forward to is partnerships like this, expanding upon those, building relationships and working with you all. It's exciting where Murphy, was taking the relationship with the Citizen Oversight Board, respecting of your role, valuing your role. I hope that you all know that I have that and some when I'm thinking of you. The first call I made, even though I was under embargo, did not make calls, was to Julia. She was the only call I made. I didn't ask for permission because it was the right thing to do, and that's the value you have to me. And so I didn't want you all to find out by the news. I didn't want you all. This has been. I don't have the luxury of a quick of a long transition. This is kind of a quick thing. So I please ask for your patience, and I am dealing. And one of the good things I think I bring to this role is I'm able to hit the ground running. And as you all know, our safety departments are facing a lot of challenges. Right now, COVID is wreaking havoc again on our first responder staff, our 911 call takers, the people that staff and keep our jail secure. I know those are all priority issues for you. I'm doing everything I can, and that is really the reason I can't spend more time with you today. We're working on getting rapid testing. I'm trying to facilitate a delivery of rapid testing from Denver Health to DDPHE to our first responders, so we can start rapid testing to get people back into service. So that's my apologies up front. I really am excited. You will have an opportunity. I hope my cell phone number is circulated with each and every one of you. I appreciate it. I've worked with Nikki and Katina in the past, and all of you. I've spoken to you in one fashion or another. You have my phone. You have my direct line. One thing I preach and one thing I try to practice is religiously is accessibility. That you all have me at, and if you have a problem. The other thing, and Elise could probably fill you in because I talk about a lot, is communication. Any successful relationship, whether it's me, my wife, my daughter, whether it's me and Julia, me and anyone on the board, me and the community, we have to have good communication. I've seen so many deteriorating relationships throughout the city because deterioration of those things really caused by lack of communication, which then makes people feel slighted, which then makes people feel marginalized, which then makes people feel not involved. That's not me. That's not who I am. I want to talk. I want to talk, and I want to take on this hard topics. I hope you've seen that before, and those of you who've interacted with me. And I try to approach everything. I try to get every side of the story. I don't get paralyzed by that. I don't have the opportunity to get paralyzed by that. I have to make decisions. I have to make hard decisions that I know sometimes will not make everyone happy, but I do like to hear from everyone. And I do want to hear your input, and it is very valuable to me. I hope you can see by the fact that I was really integral in getting the IA Pro situation moved to all cases being input, or all complaints being input at IA Pro. That is something that I work very hard on behind the scenes to make it happen. Katina, Nikki, Julie, you know the battles there, right? And you all have been asking for it for far too long. And we're working on that. And I already have scheduled a meeting to see how we're going next week. How's it doing? Because I'm going to keep close tabs on it. But that's not the only thing I'm going to keep close tabs on. Police accountability, our conduct accountability, the accountability of the people in my office and me is something that I take very really pride in. One of the things I'm happy to in my career and accomplishment is I had an impeccable record. I didn't have any discipline throughout my long career. Not to say I never made a mistake. I make mistakes all the time. But I grew up in a strict environment. I was the son of a Marine and a cop for 40 years, right? So he didn't tolerate that. And that's kind of accountability, responsibility for our actions, acknowledging when we make mistakes is values that I hold dear. I hope to spend more time with you all to discuss those, answer your questions. But Julie, I'll turn it over to you. I'll give you, I think I'm looking at my other phone. I have a few more minutes, so if I can answer any quick questions.
Great. So just start off by saying, welcome to the role. We hope as a board that, the progress we made on IA Pro the past month is a step of many progressive steps in improving the oversight environment and effectiveness of the OIM and the COB itself. We believe in accountability, and that is, hugely important to us. So, our aspiration in working with you is that that's one of many steps that we take, and are looking forward to working together. Do any board members have comments or questions for Mr. Saldate?
I just have one brief thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Armando, congratulations. I know we really appreciate also the fact that another thing that you help bring about is to ensure that our board administrator has access to IA Pro, which is also very, very important to us. It's my understanding, though, that he may only have access on the sheriff's side, and I think that we would want to broaden that to make sure that he also has access to the police complaint documents.
I was really concentrated on sheriff. That was not a intent thing. I, in fact, will be talking to the chief today, Chief Payson today, a couple of times. So I will bring that up to him. Daniel, I will get you in touch with the administrator of DPDIA Pro as well. So thank you, sir, for bringing that up.
Sure. Thank you, Armando. And again, congratulations. Yep.
Yeah, and I will always treat you with formalities, but please, you don't need to call me sir or anything like that. I'm Armando, Mondo, whatever you want to call me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Other board questions? All right, well, we'll give you just a breath before you have your swearing in ceremony. That must be exciting for your family. As a reminder to the board and community members that may be attending, our meeting with the director is February 4th. So, happy to receive community questions in anticipation of that meeting, and board members can be prepared for that discussion at that time. And then, Armando, as part of that conversation, I think we'd love to get a sense of, what are your key priorities? What do you intend to work on? What's sort of your 90-day plan for stepping into this role? And, what are you hoping to accomplish in the next, 20 months of this mayor's term? So, happy to have that be the start of our conversation. And if we have additional questions in advance, we'll send those over.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity. For any community members on the call, you are all very important to me. Your perspective is very important to me. I know we won't always agree, and I cannot make everyone happy on the call, but please, I invite you to the table. Elise, I have a great community and government affairs manager, as you all know, and Elise Ron. She's an excellent partner. She knows how community and their voice, especially those that don't have a voice or don't typically have a voice at the seat at the table, that we hear you. And so please use Elise, please, to get to me. Please, board members, contact me directly. I look forward and really encourage citizen involvement. I will have those things for you ready to talk about at our meeting. I can't wait for it. I'm working on the plan now for the year, for short-term, midterm, long-term. So I really am excited about that, and really excited to get started. I'm going to point the camera to my family. They're really important to me too, and I just want them to say hi to you all. So just want to say that to you, and thank you. I'm going to need your help. I need everyone's help, and this is a tough role. Not any tougher than what our cops, firefighters, sheriff's deputies, 911 dispatchers, our community violence interrupters, not any tougher than that job, but I really am going to need your help to solve all the challenges we face. So thank you.
Likewise, and thanks. Have a great day. Sorry, Terrence, go ahead.
I was saying that was a COB first. We never got to see an entire family before from the public safety director.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll. All right, take care.
No, Terrence is fine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks so much. I think, Daniel, that was all the business I had to cover. Are there administrative activities and discussions that you wanted to have?
I had one question with Elise on the line,
Sure.
Just because people mentioned COVID. I don't know if we've had any updates on just given Omicron and the widespread, how that's affecting both sworn officers and or the jails.
I don't have any formal updates for you today. There's some, I know there's ongoing conversations. If and when I do have those updates, I'll make sure to reach out to you and share them for sure. But I don't have any today as of right now.
No problem. I just know with the constant spread right now, I just haven't been abreast of what's been going on locally to that subpopulation. So.
And we are meeting with.
And I see Al has just joined us, so thanks, Al. And also you're listed as Katina, so just change your title there.
Well, I had a name change. Thanks.
What's it feel like?
Fantastic. I feel smarter just by having her name. I couldn't make that link work, so sorry I'm late. Katina reset it to me. Thanks.
All good. Yep. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry, just gonna keep our identity straight here for a second. There we go. Great. So I was just going to mention, April, we are going to be meeting with Chief Pazin in our next meeting in 2 weeks. And Julie had already mentioned that staffing issues, especially with the huge surge of COVID cases, is going to be one of the things we are planning on talking to him about. On that note, I did send out the 2022 calendar for board events, board meetings just this week. And I plan on publishing that to the website as well. So people get a sense of, who we're meeting with, when we're meeting with them. Of note, we are going to, the fire chief, Desmond Fulton, has agreed to meet with us in the middle of March 18th. We have not met with him in, I guess, I don't know when, but it's been a while.
Ever.
Possibly ever. And so part of that is due to the fact that the fire department has only about a dozen armed officers, arson investigators, as compared to, say, the police department's over 1,000. So just in terms of priorities, I think that's understandable, but he's going to be giving us a brief overview of his department, what all they do, and the chief of the arson investigation division is going to join us as well to give us just an overview and then be able to respond to questions, given that they are within our jurisdiction and we don't know a whole lot about them. So just wanted to highlight that. In terms of scheduling, I do not have any updates on the Citizen Oversight Board nominating committee process. That first slate is still with City Council, to the best of my knowledge. And I do not have an update from the City Attorney's Office about their lawyer-to-lawyer conversations about the term disciplinary boards. So we will be following up with them shortly and hope to get a little bit more clarity very soon. Next on the list, Stefan mentioned it, but last week I was given access to the Sheriff's Department side of IA Pro. And so I have been spending some time looking through that, reviewing complaints that are coming in, reviewing the status of a couple of complaints that we've flagged or that the board might be a little bit more concerned about or wanting to follow. We can discuss some details in executive session if the board would like. And then also just exploring some of the reporting functions in IA Pro to try to get a handle on what kind of data is available, how to pull it, and how the board might want to use it. With that said, if there's any data that you would like, especially as our annual report is coming up, if there's any data you would like to have included in that, or that you're just curious about, please let me know and I will see if I can make it happen. And if I can't, I will see if I can find somebody who can. And hopefully I'll be getting access to the police side as well. I believe the fire department does use the police side when they do have cases, although it's given the size of their department, it's going to be far fewer cases there. Moving on, in terms of Julie did mention that Denver Health did respond to us, our records request. Once you get a chance to look at that and review that, if you have any follow-up questions, I'll be putting together sort of a follow-up response. So feel free to send them to me. One of the things of note is we asked for their staffing levels, and they provided their authorized staffing levels, which is, I believe, different from their actual staffing levels. As we know, the police department and sheriff's department are authorized at about, I think, over 100 more deputies and officers than they currently have. And that's one of the problems. And so, I imagine they're probably facing some similar shortages at Denver Health, but we were also able to get some statistics on grievances, on medical kite requests, just to sort of get an understanding of the workload that they are under when they are providing those services.
And Daniel, I had 2 follow-up questions. Thanks for explaining the authorized staffing because I didn't exactly catch that. I was still wondering what the definition of other medical staff meant. So just curious who falls under that. And then we had a conversation a couple months ago about cost for kites. Does that also include medical kites having a cost to them?
My understanding of that is that the cost for medical kites is $7, but that does not apply to mental health kites. It's just for medical, and that is established in ordinance, I believe, not hospital policy, not jail or hospital policy. It's sort of considered the copay, and it's not something that has to be paid before the kite is submitted. So it's something that sort of gets added to a bill and if they're indigent, it can be forgiven, I believe. But I'm happy to see if I can get some more details on that if you'd like.
I'll keep thinking about that for
Yeah,
now.
absolutely.
Thank you.
That actually raised a question that I had in just a quick look at, I haven't done the detailed look yet at those materials, but in the sheriff's facilities, kites are for complaints, but the kite terminology seemed to relate to medical requests when it comes to the health side. Is that understanding correct, or am I confused on that?
I can double check, but I'm fairly certain that kites are just a general sort of request form, and that there are medical kites and other kites. So sort of a request for services generally, but that the medical kites are sort of separated and dealt with by Denver Health, whereas non-medical requests are handled by the DSD.
Okay. Yeah, just making sure we're really clear on that is helpful. And if there's a request versus complaint process when it comes to health stuff, that would be useful information to distinguish.
Yeah, so we did get two separate data points from Denver Health. One is the number of kites that they receive, so that's medical requests, and then the number of grievances that are filed with, so that would be a complaint against the medical services that were provided or a complaint that they weren't provided. And so they receive, I believe it's on average 150 grievances a day, and significantly more than that, or per month. Is that per month?
Yeah,
per month, sorry. Yeah. That's a big difference.
I know, it's like a day seems really high. Oh,
sorry, it's like 5 a day. 5 a day.
Like COVID numbers.
150 grievances a month. We do not know what the sustainment rate is for that, or what kind of discipline has resulted from those, if any. That's something we could ask them about if you want, but that's where that stands.
Can we make sure that the interim monitor has access to that information if he doesn't already? And then would love, Greg, when you're ready, just your perspective on that information for the board, if that's okay.
Just as an aside, I kind of found it funny that DOS or Denver Health uses the kite terminology. That's a pretty common term to refer to notes that are passed between inmates. In my experience. So it's funny that when I saw the term kite, I thought it was funny. But anyway, just as an aside.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe medical notes passed between inmates. It's
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye. Okay, thanks. Daniel, anything else on your list?
Just wanted to gauge board interest. Earlier this week, the city council did approve nearly $5 million 5-year extension to the police department's ShotSpotter contract. Not related to police discipline, but it is something that the community we have received some requests through social media about whether or not we have access to the ShotSpotter data. I don't believe we've ever requested it, but just wanted to gauge interest from the board on whether that's something that you're interested in pursuing, in requesting access to, or finding out what data they have. Yeah, so just wanted to open up that conversation because we were asked that by a community member.
So my experience with ShotSpotter is that there's actually some sort of like dashboard feature where you can kind of see where the shots have been detected. I think other cities publish that information. I don't know if ours does, but that would be a level of detail I'd be interested in. But the raw data, I'm not sure I'd be able to wrap my head around.
How does that work? How does ShotSpotter work? Oh, sorry, Julia. Sorry. How does it? I'm not that familiar with. Yeah, sorry.
So ShotSpotter essentially is they have listening devices, audio devices that are posted around the city currently, I believe it's 14 square miles of Denver are covered. And they are designed to detect loud gunfire-like noises, and then be able to triangulate that roughly and send an alert to the police about the location of a possible gunshot. Elise, if you want to give a little bit more detail about that, you go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I can also send over, sometimes it's hard to find on Legistar, but I can send over the PowerPoint that the police presented to Safety Committee on December 15th, if that would be helpful. That gives a little bit more information about what ShotSpotter is. But Daniel's correct, it's a gunshot detection and location system. So it's designed to detect, verify, and then notify law enforcement of gunfire. So when they call it an array, we have 14 square miles of an array of different arrays, and ShotSpotter will detect where gunfire occurs within about 25 meters, how it occurs, so round count, and then the time that that gunfire occurs. So from there, when it's detected, officers are alerted via their cell phone app and the vehicle computer terminal within about 60 seconds. And then they're able to respond to gunfire in real time. So it's used by patrol officers, analysts, detectives, and command staff. To give you an idea of a little bit of the data, we included quite a bit in the presentation. There were in 2020, 3,093 alerts. So far in 2021, as of December 7th, when we pulled data, it was 3,843 alerts. And what's really important, I think, to note about ShotSpotter is that gunfire is often unreported. An average, and this is a Denver stat that we pulled, an average of 85.5% of ShotSpotter alerts have no correlating 911 call. And that was between 2018 and 2021. So it's really important that officers are able to respond to that gunfire, because we often will not receive a correlating 911 call. They can identify victims, retrieve evidence. They go back the next day also to retrieve further evidence, whether it be shell casings, and then do cross checks with NIBIN to see if it's associated with other crimes, et cetera. So there's a lot in there in that PowerPoint. If it is helpful, I'm happy to send that over. Sounds like you're saying yes. Okay, great. I'll send that over for sure.
And everyone, I just put a link in the chat for an article about things like ShotSpotter and other artificial intelligence. It's somewhat critical of it, but I found it to be a very good read when it comes to the use of AI by law enforcement and some of the concerns that people have, because we do know that, for instance, facial recognition software does not work as well for people of color as it does with other folks. So good article. I thought it was worth the read.
Thanks
I
for
just
sending
shared that
around.
again for the public.
Thanks. I know. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just reposted the link for the public. Terrence, you just sent it to the panelists. So.
Oh, okay. I'm a Luddite. I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so lots of potential discussion there. The short story of the article that Terrence sent around is that it doesn't necessarily make communities safer or help police respond.
Yeah, there's more emerging social science literature that's been coming out, and that's what a lot of the community has had access to, that's saying it's not making communities any safer. And then just again, some of those DI related concerns that Terrence mentioned earlier. So again, I don't know if this is entirely our spot, but I know this is a call and request of community, as other jurisdictions are also tackling the same problem and denying it in their city budgets.
So we are meeting with the police chief later this month. I just switched off the tab with our calendar, January 21st. So perhaps we can have questions from the board on that topic. And thanks for sending around that information, Terrence. If Department of Safety has other data they'd like the board to be aware of in anticipation of that conversation with the chief, that's great. Obviously, we want everyone's side of the information, but I did, in the information shared with council, I know there were a number of community members who were concerned about expanding that contract. So worth our awareness.
And
what else?
For the record, the contract has been expanded. So for the next 5 years, it's more of a question of how it is utilized, rather than whether or not we expand it or continue it. So just to make sure that's clear. The next thing before we talk about the annual report was NACOLE. Julie, you'd asked those of us who had attended the NACOLE conference in mid-December, so that's Stefan, myself, and Karen, to share a bit about takeaways or what we learned from that time. And I have a couple things. Stefan took copious notes, so we can maybe try to give an overview
Yeah,
there.
who would like to go first? Yeah.
But I can just say, two things that, two very concrete takeaways that I took, was able to have or take away. Was one, in one of the sessions that focused on a shooting in Chicago, Harith Augustus particularly, it came up that body-worn cameras are by default, once they're activated, they capture the previous 30 seconds of video, but not audio. And then once they're activated, from that point, they also capture audio. And that is simply a default setting. It's not a technologically limited setting. And so if we were to, it is something that we could advocate for if we wanted to just simply change that setting in Denver, so that when they activate their body-worn cameras, it captures the prior 30 seconds of video and audio, which can potentially lend a lot of clarity to what was said, what orders were given prior to the activation. Because as it can happen, you get into the middle of a situation and then you activate your body-worn camera, rather than you're not always activating it. You don't always know when something's going to happen. You can't always activate it in advance. And so that is one sort of concrete takeaway that I wanted to share with the board. The other one related to Denver's STAR program. And we met with Chief Payson a couple months ago at this point, I believe. And he had mentioned that, even in the best case scenario, it looked like roughly 4% of 911 calls would be eligible for the STAR response. And so, it wasn't a silver bullet. It's 4% is significant and helpful. One of the attendees there that I chatted with pointed me in the direction of a 2020 legislative report from Denver City Council that said that it was more likely to be eligible for about 15% of calls as opposed to 4%. I was not aware of that report. I'm not sure if the board is. It predated my time there, and it didn't apparently get very much publicity, but it looks like the discrepancy is likely due to some poor data collection practices that failed to account for calls outside of STAR's current operational area and hours of operation. So rather than examining the potential realm of calls that could potentially be STAR eligible, it was examining the calls that, given the current constraints of STAR's program, were eligible. So that's something that I have the report and I could share it with the board, but that's another concrete takeaway that I had. It was also very nice to meet Nick Mitchell, Janina Orlando, and Brian Core, Brian Core is on the screening committee as our expert for the new independent monitor. And then Janina and Nick were former OIM employees.
Great. Stefan or Karen, thoughts from you?
Karen, why don't you go ahead, and then I can go last if you want.
Okay. Something that struck me in terms of the existence of oversight boards in different states and the support that they get from the community, the support that comes from government and law enforcement, is that in a lot of places, the oversight boards are not supported financially. They're not supported in terms of having a place at the table, so to speak. And that was very interesting to me in light of the fact that we have a budget. We do have support from law enforcement, although it's not at the level and intensity that we would like. It does exist, and it's quite a contrast to what I was hearing from other participants there at the conference, and something that I will keep in mind going forward especially when I am feeling very frustrated and outraged by the lack of what feels like power and the ability to do what we think the community wants in an oversight board.
Can I say something on that? It's a very good observation, Karen, and that's one of the first things that you recognize when you start looking around the country. That is, we have some holes, but compared to a lot of other cities, Denver is way ahead of the curve. I just thought that was the first thing that I recognized in my first NACOLE event.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thanks to everyone on the board who's helped us.
Could I say something on that, Julia?
Appreciate that. Go ahead.
You know, one of the things that I've realized over the last 5 years is that these oversight systems aren't static. You know, they're not created perfect, and if we work continuously to make them better, like we did with the last ordinance change, which I just have to keep giving thanks to Katina for her hard work on, and the ordinance change before that, and the ordinance changes and charter changes led by community members before that. You know, that's how we get a strong oversight system in Denver, is continually working to change the laws and improve the mechanism. So I look forward to seeing what happens, you know, what this board brings to the table in that department.
And just because
Karen, anything else?
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I realized I didn't define NACOLE for the public. It's the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement conference that we participated in mid-December.
Great. Well, we'll round it out with Stefan. Go ahead.
Thanks, Julia. Well, first I want to say I had a great time with Daniel and Karen, and Tucson was beautiful, just beautiful. And the setting was really nice. I mean, I hadn't traveled for a while, so it was nice. I think I told Daniel if the conference was being held now, you know, I wouldn't have gone, given perhaps a lot of others. But anyway, it was great. I thought a lot of the speakers were really terrific, and learned a lot. I was focused in terms of what I was taking notes on was the sort of the effective, what people were saying about what constituted effective civilian oversight practices that, you know, we try to engage in all the time. And the constant theme that ran through a lot of presentations was the engagement of the community and the importance of doing that to gain support for our efforts. And the fact that, you know, in a lot of the community, you know, trying to bring it home here doesn't really know what we do. And I know COVID's a big part of that over the last couple of years, but just the importance of engagement and convening listening sessions or summits, and using social media and the types of engagement, you know, sort of meeting people where they are so that we can get the community support. I mean, a big message was, if the community has your back, you know, you're always going to have the support that you need to try to bring about the reforms that you're trying to do. And that, you know, that really resonated with me. And also to try to be, and I know we try to be, so much of civilian oversight is reactive now, and the importance of trying to get ahead of things and be proactive about things like, you know, we've been working on policies forever. I mean, getting the policies in place so that that's a proactive step to make sure that we're not reacting to, you know, to tragedies or other things that come up. So, and then of course, and we're just making strides here now. I mean, the importance of getting unfettered access to relevant records. I know what Karen said is absolutely true. I mean, we're ahead of the game in a lot of respects, but I found, Karen, a lot of these folks I was talking to were saying they have access to everything, every peacekeeper. And I know Katina, when we raised this before, Katina said this, that we dealt with this earlier, but a lot of these boards have subpoena power. And so therefore the breadth of information that's important, that's important here is much more accessible to them, I guess, than it is to us. Now, I mean, we're limited, we're a volunteer board, time limited, all that. We couldn't possibly get involved in investigations at that level. We rely on OIM to do that. Another thing was sort of gaining a much better understanding, and I know we've scratched the surface on this a little bit, and Julia, you've raised this too, about understanding the training that's provided to law enforcement officers. And again, that's sort of a proactive approach, right? Understanding before you get somebody in there who really shouldn't be a law enforcement officer, and and Terrence has spoken about this too, is what type of training are people getting? Trauma training, cultural sensitivity training, things like that. And that's an important role for us to have, to make sure that the training is appropriate, so we're getting the right people in law enforcement and we get a better understanding of the hiring process. Let's see, and then another thing was making sure that, and this is another thing we're dealing with, that the appropriate feedback and responses are provided to citizens who make complaints. Again, the importance, Armando was just referring to this in our context, the importance of being heard, right? I mean, somebody makes a complaint and then they don't hear anything about what happens at all. And there should be a formal process to get back to a complainant and say, this is how we handle your complaint, even if it wasn't sustained. Make them realize that, what they did was important. Frankly, it took courage, a lot of courage, to come forward and make a complaint like that. At a minimum, they deserve to hear what the result of that was. And then I know we talked about this and encouraging mediation in those contexts. It's really important to humanize both law enforcement and people that are making complaints and their families, so people can see, everybody can see in this process that there are real people, real potential victims here, and they can gain a better understanding of each other. You were talking about body cameras, Daniel. A couple of folks were talking about doing body-worn camera audits. I mean, we're just starting to eat, under the Senate bill, we're just starting to even require them statewide, but that would be a good resource to start doing body-worn camera audits to show perhaps, are there interactions at law enforcement in certain neighborhoods that are handled differently with the body cameras than other neighborhoods, and the like. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop talking, is NACOLE really has incredible resources. I mean, I wasn't very aware of the organization. People like, Katina and Nikki and others are very much aware. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, they have like 13 principles of effective civilian oversight by the current president. There's all kinds of stuff that we can just get off their website, or Daniel can get otherwise. Even the PowerPoints that were used by the speakers during the conference were fantastic. I would recommend that they be circulated. They're really, really informative. And then, Nick did a great job. We kind of helped, we participated a little bit. He did his presentation was sort of a case study on, he appeared with this guy, Andrew Brunson, who is the counsel to the Commissioner Inspector General in New York City. And Brunson had done his own report about the police response to the social justice protests in 2020. He was very impressive, just like Nick was. And they did a really nice job, both of them. And there were questions that were asked, and then we responded a little bit because Nick had questions because he hadn't been involved for a while. So Karen, Daniel, and I were there to help out a little bit. But boy, that was really great. That was kind of a highlight for us because it brought it home. Anyway, I'll stop talking now, but it was really great, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to have been able to go.
Julia, can I ask a follow-up question of a couple of the attendees?
Yes.
The NACOLE attendees. So first, Daniel, thank you very much for sharing that about the body-worn cameras. I did think that was a technological limit. I imagine if we ask around, keeping the audio off might, cost less because we don't have to store as much data, but I would be very interested in following that thread of turning the audio on. I've seen, I've watched videos from our OIM over the last 5 years that have suffered from that absence of data. And I'm wondering if anyone who attended any body-worn panels, Stefan, you kind of alluded to doing some, analysis of what we're seeing in maybe body-worn camera footage that hasn't been flagged for a full investigation. Did anyone mention any technologies? Are there any computer-aided softwares perhaps that were brought up, or anything that we can feed the footage through that might flag us, sort of like shot putters or shot detectors supposed to do, for what we might want to investigate?
Daniel and Karen, you might remember more than I think that was just an issue, to flag for something that civilian oversight boards might want to ask for or ask law enforcement officers to do are called body-worn camera audits. But I don't recall any discussion about the technology that was used to conduct those audits, but I'm sure that's something we could follow up on.
Yeah, I'll just say too that Axion, the company that makes most body-worn cameras, does have pretty advanced AI capabilities. So scanning through videos and things like that, particularly for investigative purposes, not investigations of the police, but investigations of the community. So, certainly there are major advances on the policing side that, perhaps could be leveraged for this purpose as well. And I'm not familiar with how departments could use them for their own, confirming officers are wearing them, those kinds of things, but surely that exists.
I think we had discussed in the summer of 2020, possibly having a meeting with a representative from Axiom to be briefed about what technologies exist on their back end. And maybe that's something that we could, put in the queue for the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, Daniel, let's add it onto our action item list, and for those on the board, be prepared to be terrified. So yeah, I think it's worth a conversation. Any other questions for our board members who attended the conference?
Yeah, thank you H for that report out, and I hope we bring some of these talking points to our retreat later, because I think there's some great goals in there. From some of the observations you had on next directions for us. So thanks again.
Great.
Great.
I think the only last thing I had was a discussion about the annual report process, especially given that this is going to be happening directly in the middle of hiring the new independent monitor. And so I don't want to lean too heavily on Julia during that time. She is busy, and so I wanted to go over some of the things that I broke some of the parts of the annual report and see if there was board member interest in sort of taking ownership of the development of that process. Obviously, the full board has to approve the full annual report, but have some specific points of contact as to, so I don't feel like I should be the one fully drafting the entire report without board input. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. And so if there's any board members who are particularly interested in one part of the annual report, I'd be happy to work with you and sort of get you more involved in that process. Our ordinance, ordinance, yes, requires us to do 6 things in the report. The first one is to assess the work of the independent monitor's office. The second one is to describe our activities during the previous year. The third is to note any concerns expressed by citizens during the year. The 4th, 5th, and 6th go together. The 4th being the board's assessment of the Department of Safety, police, sheriff, and fire departments' investigative and disciplinary processes. And then 5 is recommendations for ways that those 4 departments can improve their relationship with the citizens. And 6 is recommendations for those 4 departments, how they can improve their policies, rules, hiring, training, complaint process. And so I've sort of broken it into three different categories, one being the evaluation of the independent monitor that usually consists of a quantitative data aspect, and then a qualitative aspect that includes a staff survey, oftentimes interviews or questionnaires for safety department leadership, possibly public comment if we wanted to include that. So that's sort of one bucket, evaluating the OIM. Second bucket being lists of things that we did this year, accomplished, changes that happened on our watch, and as well as lists of community concerns. So that's sort of the second bucket that I had. And then the third bucket is really those last three recommendations of analyzing the 4 public safety departments and recommendations to improve the relationship with the public and to improve their internal processes. So those are sort of the 3 buckets that I'm hoping to, if a board member wants to volunteer for a particular one or be more involved in a particular aspect of that report, that's something that I'm going to be working on a lot over the next 2 months and would value more engagement on. So I can leave that there. You don't. Go ahead.
Do you have a goal in mind in terms of when the annual report would be published?
So it is by ordinance required to be published at the same time as the OIM's annual report, and that is March 15th. Okay. So ideally, I would want it in pretty much finished condition by the beginning of March to give, if we need to make some final changes, do a little proofreading. But March 15th is our very hard deadline.
Okay.
And,
okay, thanks for that, Daniel. If there are board members who want to partner with Daniel on that, that would be great. Appreciate that work so much, especially since it is required of us to complete. We don't have a choice on that one. All right, is there any other board business that members would like to bring up in this forum? Okay, well, with that, I will adjourn this meeting and convene us into executive session.
I did want to also, sorry, Nikki had a question for the independent monitor's office. That's going to be, some of the specifics are going to be discussed during executive session, but I did just want to highlight before we go into executive session for the public that we are going to be discussing it. And that was requests for any complaint data and cases that were related to transgender issues. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing with the independent monitor's office in executive session.
People reminding me of that. All right, with that, I will close this meeting. Thank everyone for your attendance and reconvene into executive session.